The road of memories. The sweltering heat of a midsummer afternoon bore down mercilessly on a lone stretch of highway, carving a path through the quiet, sleepy countryside. The landscape was serene yet eerily still, as if even nature held its breath. Occasionally, a tumbleweed would dance across the cracked asphalt, propelled by an intermittent gust of wind. Few cars traversed this forgotten route, a relic of bygone days before modern highways diverted the heavy traffic elsewhere. Amid this desolation, an old, weather-beaten truck rumbled steadily forward, its engine humming with a persistence that mirrored its driver's spirit. The truck's exterior, with its peeling paint and slight dents, spoke of a lifetime of service, a lifetime of resilience. At the wheel sat James J.C. Carter, a man whose mere presence commanded respect, even in the humblest of settings. At 62 years old, James was an unassuming figure. His face was a map of life's trials, etched with deep lines that told stories of battles fought, both literal and metaphorical. His graying hair peeked out from beneath a frayed cap, and his piercing brown eyes gazed at the endless road ahead with a mix of focus and nostalgia. His attire was simple, a faded blue button-up shirt tucked into a pair of worn jeans, sturdy boots completing the look. But in his quiet dignity, there was a strength that no uniform could bestow. Resting on the passenger seat beside him was a small brown paper bag containing a modest lunch, a ham and cheese sandwich, a green apple, and a bottle of water. Beside it sat an object far more significant, a navy blue cap, its golden anchor emblem catching the sunlight streaming through the windshield. The cap symbolized James's illustrious past as an admiral in the United States Navy, a past he had chosen to leave behind in favor of a quieter life in a small town. Yet the cap also served as a reminder, a link to a legacy he could never truly set aside. James glanced at the cap, a faint smile playing on his lips. His thoughts drifted to his granddaughter, Emily, the bright star of his life. Her relentless optimism and belief in him were his greatest joys. That afternoon, he was on his way to fulfill a promise to her, a promise to speak at the local community center. Emily had insisted he share his story with the town, emphasizing the lessons he had learned throughout his storied career and the challenges he had faced since retiring. Though James preferred the quiet solace of his own company, he couldn't deny Emily's request. As if on cue, his phone buzzed, a tinny ringtone cutting through the hum of the truck's engine. James reached into his shirt pocket and retrieved the device, an ancient flip phone with a cracked screen. The name Emily glowed faintly on the display. Pressing the green button, he put the phone on speaker. "Grandpa, are you on your way?" Emily's voice burst forth, bright and full of life. James chuckled, his voice deep and steady. "I'm on the road, kiddo. This old truck of mine isn't exactly a speedster, but it gets the job done. Just making sure," Emily said with mock sternness. "Don't forget your speech. Everyone's counting on you." "I've got it," James assured her, glancing at the leather briefcase on the backseat. Inside was a carefully handwritten speech, one he had spent hours crafting. "Don't you worry, Em. This old man keeps his promises." "You're not old," Emily protested. "You're timeless." James laughed, his heart warmed by her words. "That's kind of you to say. I'll see you soon, sweetheart." As the call ended, James placed the phone back on the seat, his thoughts momentarily drifting to the speech he had prepared. He had poured his heart into it, determined to inspire the community with tales of resilience, courage, and unity. He hoped to remind them that life, no matter how challenging, was a journey worth embracing. The hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the tires against the road lulled James into a reflective state. Memories surfaced unbidden. Memories of roaring seas, of urgent commands shouted across the decks of naval vessels, of camaraderie and sacrifice. He could still hear the sound of waves crashing against the hull, still feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. His years in the Navy had shaped him, molding him into the man he was today. Yet, despite his achievements, James had chosen a life of humility in his retirement. He lived simply, valuing peace over prestige. His home was a modest cabin on the edge of town, surrounded by nature's tranquility. His days were spent tending to a small vegetable garden, volunteering at the community center, and enjoying time with Emily. He had traded the roar of the ocean for the whisper of the wind through the trees, and he wouldn't have it any other way. But the road ahead was about to remind James that life's challenges didn't always come with warning signs. The piercing wail of a siren shattered the calm, jolting James from his reverie. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, where flashing red and blue lights filled the frame. A patrol car was speeding toward him, its presence an unwelcome intrusion on the peaceful highway. James sighed, pulling the truck over to the side of the road. His tires crunched against the gravel as he came to a stop. He turned off the engine and rolled down the window, letting the oppressive heat flood the cabin. He wasn't alarmed. This wasn't the first time he'd been stopped. His truck's worn appearance often attracted attention from law enforcement. The patrol car came to a halt behind him, and two officers emerged. Leading the way was Officer Ryan Blake, a tall, broad-shouldered man with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. His uniform was immaculate, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting the blinding sunlight. Trailing behind him was Officer Sean Miller, younger and visibly less confident. Miller's hesitant steps and darting glances betrayed his inexperience. Blake approached James's window, his posture radiating superiority. He rapped on the door with his knuckles, the sound sharp and intrusive. "Afternoon, sir," Blake said, his tone clipped. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" James met his gaze evenly, his voice calm. "No, officer, I don't." Blake smirked, leaning closer. "You were driving too slow. That's dangerous, especially on a road like this." James raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He knew better than to argue. "License and registration," Blake demanded. James retrieved his license from his pocket and handed it over, his movements deliberate. Blake snatched it without so much as a thank you, glancing at the document with a look of disdain. "Step out of the vehicle," Blake ordered. "I need to take a look inside." James hesitated. His instincts told him the situation was unnecessary, even unfair, but he complied. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. Despite his age, he moved with a quiet dignity that seemed to irritate Blake. As James stood by his truck, Blake began rummaging through the cabin, his actions unnecessarily aggressive. Items were tossed carelessly onto the ground. The brown paper bag, the briefcase, even the Navy cap. Blake picked up the cap, inspecting it as if it were a counterfeit bill. "What's this?" he sneered. "Some kind of costume." James's voice was steady but firm. "That's mine. I served in the United States Navy. Retired as an admiral." Blake froze for a moment, then laughed. A sharp, mocking sound. "You? An admiral? Don't make me laugh." Sean Miller, standing a few steps behind, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked between James and Blake, a hint of unease in his expression. But he said nothing. James's gaze never wavered. He stood tall, his presence unshaken despite the blatant disrespect. The golden anchor on the cap glinted in the sunlight, a silent testament to his truth. Unbeknownst to them, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would challenge their perceptions, their principles, and their very sense of justice. For James Carter, this moment was not just an inconvenience. It was the beginning of a battle for dignity, one he would face with the same quiet courage that had defined his life. The spark of defiance. The dry gravel crunched beneath James Carter's boots as he stood beside his truck, the midday sun baking the earth around him. Despite the oppressive heat and the simmering tension in the air, his expression remained calm, his posture upright, as if he were back on the bridge of a naval vessel, commanding respect by presence alone. Across from him, Officer Ryan Blake rifled through the contents of James's old truck with a palpable air of contempt. Items were flung carelessly onto the dusty ground. the modest lunch, the leather briefcase containing James's carefully written speech, and even the framed photograph of his late wife. Blake's every movement seemed to be an assertion of dominance, a display of unchecked authority. The younger officer, Sean Miller, stood a few paces behind Blake, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. The scene unfolding before him was wrong. He knew it deep in his gut, but fear clamped down on his voice like a vice. He avoided James's gaze, ashamed of his silence. "Look at this junk," Blake muttered, pulling out the Navy cap. He held it up as though it were a piece of evidence in a crime. "This yours?" His tone dripped with mockery. James didn't flinch. "Yes, it is." Blake smirked. "Let me guess. Some kind of souvenir. You pick it up at a flea market." "No," James replied evenly. "I earned it." Blake laughed, a harsh, derisive sound that echoed across the empty highway. "You earned this? Don't make me laugh, old man." James's gaze didn't waver, but a flicker of steel entered his voice. "That cap represents over 3 decades of service in the United States Navy. It's not a trinket, officer." Blake's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, tossing the cap onto the ground. The golden anchor emblem caught the sunlight, glinting defiantly against the dust. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his conscience gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. He glanced at Blake, then at James, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "Officer Blake," he ventured hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper, "maybe we should." "Stay out of it, Miller," Blake snapped, cutting him off. "This is standard procedure." Miller fell silent, his shoulders slumping. He didn't have the courage to push back, not yet. James watched the exchange, his sharp mind assessing the dynamics between the two officers. Blake was clearly in charge, his arrogance and bluster masking a deep insecurity. Miller, on the other hand, was a man at a crossroads, torn between duty and morality. James's years of leadership had taught him to read people, and he saw an opportunity to plant a seed of doubt in Miller's mind. "You're young," James said, addressing Miller directly. His voice was calm but carried the weight of experience. "Still figuring out who you are, I'd wager. It's not easy, is it?" Miller looked startled, his eyes darting to Blake for guidance, but the senior officer was too preoccupied with rummaging through the truck to notice. James continued, his tone gentle but firm. "There'll come a time when you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be. Will you stand by and watch injustice, or will you find the courage to speak out?" Miller opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, his face a mask of conflict. He looked away, ashamed. Blake straightened up, holding the shattered photo frame in his hand. The glass glittered like shards of ice in the sun. He glanced at the photograph. A younger James, his arm around a woman with a kind smile, and sneered. "Who's this?" "Your wife," Blake asked, his tone mocking. "She put up with you all those years." James's jaw tightened, the only visible sign of the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "That's my late wife, Margaret. She passed away 5 years ago." Blake chuckled, tossing the broken frame back onto the ground. "Guess she's lucky she doesn't have to deal with you anymore." Miller's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "Blake," he began, his voice trembling with outrage. "Shut it, Miller," Blake barked, silencing the younger officer. "You're here to observe, not to question me." But the damage was done. Miller's hesitation had cracked Blake's veneer of absolute authority, and James seized the moment. "Is this what you signed up for?" James asked, his voice steady and unyielding. "To disrespect the dead, to trample on someone's dignity. If so, you're in the wrong line of work." Blake whirled around, his face flushed with anger. "You don't get to lecture me, old man," he snarled, stepping closer to James. "I call the shots here, not you." James met Blake's glare without flinching, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the younger man's escalating fury. "Respect is earned, officer," he said quietly. and you've done nothing to earn mine." For a moment, the two men stood face to face, the tension crackling between them like a live wire. Blake's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out. But before he could act, the sound of a car engine broke the silence. A silver sedan pulled to a stop on the opposite side of the road, its driver watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The door opened, and a young man in his late 20s stepped out, his phone already in his hand. His name was Liam Jones, and he had stumbled upon the scene by chance while driving home from work. "What's going on here?" Liam called out, his voice cutting through the oppressive heat. Blake turned, his irritation palpable. "Move along, sir. This doesn't concern you." Liam didn't budge. Instead, he raised his phone, the camera lens gleaming in the sunlight. "Looks like it concerns everyone," he said. "I'm recording this." Blake's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "Turn that off," he growled. "This is police business." Liam smirked, undeterred. "And this is public property. I have every right to record." Blake's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might march over and confiscate the phone. But Liam stood his ground, his defiance a mirror of James's quiet strength. James watched the interaction with a flicker of hope. Liam's presence, though unexpected, was a lifeline. It disrupted the balance of power, forcing Blake to think twice about his actions. Miller, too, seemed emboldened by Liam's arrival. He stepped forward, his voice firmer than before. "Blake, maybe we should let him go," he said. "There's nothing here to justify this stop." Blake rounded on him, his face a mask of fury. "Are you questioning me, Miller?" Miller hesitated, but then his gaze shifted to James, who nodded subtly, as if to say, "You can do this." Drawing a deep breath, Miller straightened his spine. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining strength. "I am." The words hung in the air, a challenge that Blake couldn't ignore. For the first time, his authority was being questioned, not just by an outsider, but by his own subordinate. James watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He knew that this moment, small as it might seem, was the beginning of something larger. The tide was turning, and the first ripples of change were spreading outward. Liam continued recording, his steady hand capturing every detail. His presence was a reminder that justice, though often slow and imperfect, could not be silenced. And in that moment, James felt a surge of hope, not just for himself, but for the younger generation. Perhaps the world wasn't as lost as it sometimes seemed. As the sun beat down on the quiet highway, a battle of wills played out, a battle that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. And though the outcome was still uncertain, one thing was clear: James Carter was not a man to be underestimated. The unraveling of authority. The oppressive heat of the midday sun bore down on the quiet highway, now a theater of confrontation and defiance. The air, heavy with tension, seemed to vibrate with the unspoken words and suppressed emotions of the individuals standing on the dusty roadside. James Carter stood steady, a pillar of quiet resilience, his gaze unwavering as he faced Officer Ryan Blake's scowl. Behind him, the younger officer, Sean Miller, was no longer just a passive observer. His hands trembled slightly, but the resolve in his expression was unmistakable. Across the road, Liam Jones continued recording, his camera phone trained on the unfolding scene, determined to capture every detail of what he instinctively knew was a moment of profound injustice. Ryan Blake's fury was palpable. His grip tightened on his belt, his chest heaving as he struggled to maintain his authority in the face of mounting challenges. His carefully curated persona of control was slipping, unraveling thread by thread. "You've overstepped, Miller," Blake growled, his voice low and menacing. "We're not here to question each other. We're here to do our jobs." Miller took a shaky step forward, his voice wavering but firm. "This isn't doing our job, Blake. This is harassment. He hasn't done anything wrong." Blake's eyes flashed with anger. You don't get to make that call, he snapped. I'm in charge here. No, Miller said, his voice rising in strength. You're abusing your authority, and I won't stand by and watch. The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Blake to respond. For a moment, the two officers stood locked in a silent battle of wills. Then, as if to reassert his dominance, Blake turned sharply to James. You think you're clever, don't you? Blake spat, hiding behind her supposed rank, pulling at the heartstrings of these bleeding hearts. But it won't work. I know your type. James's expression didn't falter. And what type is that, officer? Blake sneered, stepping closer until he was inches from James's face. The kind that thinks they're above the law. The kind that plays the victim every chance they get. Liam, still recording from across the road, couldn't stay silent any longer. You're the one playing games here, he called out, his voice clear and defiant. Everyone can see it. Blake whirled around, his anger now directed at Liam. Stay out of this, he barked. Turn off that camera and get back in your car. Not a chance, Liam shot back. The world deserves to see this. Blake took a threatening step toward Liam, but James's voice, calm and commanding, stopped him in his tracks. Leave him alone, James said. He's not the problem here. Blake spun back to face James, his face red with fury. You don't tell me what to do. James didn't flinch. I'm not telling you. I'm reminding you. Your duty is to serve and protect, not to bully and intimidate. Blake's fists clenched at his sides, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might lose control entirely. But before he could act, the faint sound of another engine reached their ears. All eyes turned toward the source of the noise. A sleek black SUV appeared in the distance, its polished exterior gleaming in the sunlight. It approached swiftly, its tires kicking up a small cloud of dust as it pulled over behind the patrol car. The door opened, and out stepped a woman in her late 40s, her tailored suit and confident stride exuding authority. She was Captain Eleanor Hayes, the commanding officer of the local precinct. Her arrival sent a ripple through the group. Sean Miller straightened immediately, his relief palpable. Blake's face twisted in a mix of frustration and unease, while James watched with quiet curiosity. Captain Hayes, Blake greeted her, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. What brings you out here? Hayes's sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the scattered belongings on the ground, the tense stances of the men, and Liam's phone still recording. Her jaw tightened, and her tone was cold when she finally spoke. I received a call from a concerned citizen, she said, her gaze landing briefly on Liam. Said there was a potential abuse of power happening on this stretch of road. Imagine my surprise when I find my own officers involved. Blake's forced smile faltered. There's been a misunderstanding, Captain. This man, he gestured to James, was acting suspiciously. I was conducting a routine investigation. Suspicious, Hayes repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. She turned to James. Sir, may I ask who you are? James, ever composed, extended a hand. James Carter, ma'am. Retired Admiral, United States Navy. Hayes's eyes widened slightly, recognition dawning. She shook his hand firmly. Admiral Carter, I've read about you. It's an honor. Blake's face turned a deep shade of red as Hayes turned back to him. Suspicious, Officer Blake. She repeated, her voice cutting like a blade. Did you even bother to verify his identity before tearing through his belongings? Blake stammered, his usual confidence crumbling. I didn't have the chance. You didn't have the chance, Hayes snapped. You had plenty of time to destroy his property and disrespect his service, but not enough to check his credentials. Miller stepped forward, his voice steady. Captain, if I may, I tried to intervene. I told Blake this wasn't right. Hayes nodded, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Officer Miller. I'll take that into account. Blake's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came. Hayes turned back to James, her tone apologetic. "Admiral, I deeply regret what you've been subjected to today. This is not how we operate." James nodded. "Thank you, Captain, but the damage is done." Hayes's gaze hardened as she looked at Blake. "You'll be hearing from me, Officer Blake, and I strongly suggest you consider your future carefully." Blake's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew he had lost. As Hayes began gathering James's scattered belongings, Liam stepped forward, his phone still in hand. "Captain Hayes," he said, "I recorded everything. If you need evidence, I've got it." Hayes nodded gratefully. "Thank you. That will be helpful." James placed a hand on Liam's shoulder. "Thank you for stepping up," he said. "It takes courage to do what you did." Liam smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "I just did what was right." As the scene finally began to settle, James retrieved his Navy cap from the ground, brushing off the dust. He placed it back on the passenger seat of his truck, the golden anchor gleaming as if it had never been tarnished. The confrontation might have ended, but its consequences were far from over. For Ryan Blake, the unraveling of his authority was only the beginning of his reckoning. For Sean Miller, it was a turning point, a moment that would shape the kind of officer and man he wanted to be. And for James Carter, it was a reminder that dignity and courage, even in the face of injustice, could inspire change. As James climbed back into his truck and started the engine, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The road ahead was long, but he knew he wasn't traveling it alone. The ripple of consequences, the hum of James Carter's truck engine faded into the distance as he left the chaotic scene behind. But for the people he had encountered that afternoon, the story was far from over. The confrontation on the quiet highway had planted seeds of reckoning and change, seeds that would soon grow into consequences for everyone involved. Ryan Blake, the fall from grace. The precinct was buzzing with a strange energy when Officer Ryan Blake arrived the next morning. Whispers followed him through the hallways, colleagues giving him sideward glances as he passed. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a sense of judgment and scrutiny that hadn't been there before. Blake prided himself on his ability to command respect, but today he felt like a man walking into enemy territory. He reached his desk and found a sealed envelope waiting for him. The sight of the precinct's letterhead sent a chill down his spine. The contents were as damning as he had feared. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Blake clenched his jaw, crumpling the letter in his fist. His mind raced with indignation. How had this spiraled so far out of control? But deep down, he knew the answer. The video captured by the young man on the highway, Liam, had gone viral overnight, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The footage painted a damning picture. An officer drunk on power, bullying a man who had done nothing wrong. The fallout was swift. Local news outlets picked up the story, and the public outcry was relentless. Community leaders called for accountability, citing the incident as yet another example of systemic abuse of power. Even members of the precinct who had once admired Blake now distanced themselves, unwilling to be tarnished by association. Blake stormed into Captain Hayes's office, slamming the door behind him. "You can't suspend me over this," he said, his voice tight with anger. It was a routine stop. That's all. Hayes looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. "Routine," she repeated coldly. "You call humiliating a retired Navy admiral routine, destroying his property, disrespecting his service. You embarrassed this department, Blake. And worse, you betrayed the trust the community places in us." Blake bristled. "I was just doing my job." "No," Hayes said, her voice firm. "You were abusing your position, and now you'll face the consequences." Blake stormed out, his mind clouded with resentment. But as he drove home, alone and fuming, the doubts began to creep in. His carefully constructed persona of authority was crumbling, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the ugly truth about himself. Sean Miller, a new path. For Officer Sean Miller, the events of that day were a turning point. He had been shaken to his core, not just by Blake's actions, but by his own inaction. The shame of standing silently while injustice unfolded before his eyes haunted him. That evening, Miller sat in his small apartment, replaying the scene in his mind. He thought about James's words, spoken with quiet strength. "There'll come a time when you'll have to decide what kind of man you want to be." Those words had struck a chord, forcing Miller to reevaluate his values and his role as an officer. The next morning, Miller walked into Captain Hayes's office and requested a meeting. "I need to speak up about what happened," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I can't stay silent anymore." Hayes listened as Miller recounted the events in detail, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. When he finished, she nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," she said, "and even more to do the right thing after that. I'll make sure your statement is included in the investigation." As Miller left her office, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he felt like he was truly living up to the ideals of his badge. He resolved to be better, to use his position to protect and serve, not to intimidate and control. And he vowed never to let fear silence him again. James Carter, a voice for change. James returned to his small cabin on the outskirts of town, seeking solace in the quiet comfort of home. But the events of the day lingered in his mind, refusing to be brushed aside. He couldn't ignore the fact that his experience was not unique, that countless others had faced similar injustices, often without the privilege of a witness or a platform to speak out. Emily, his granddaughter, arrived later that evening. Her face lit up with excitement. "Grandpa, you're all over the internet," she exclaimed, holding up her phone. "Everyone's talking about what happened." James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't ask for this kind of attention, Em." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "But maybe it's a good thing. People are listening. They're inspired by how you handled it." James looked at her, his expression thoughtful. He had always believed in leading by example, but he had never sought the spotlight. Now, however, he saw an opportunity to use his voice to advocate for change. The next day, James contacted the local community center and offered to speak at a town hall event. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life gathered to hear him speak, drawn by his reputation as a man of integrity and resilience. Standing at the podium, James addressed the crowd with the same quiet strength that had defined him throughout his life. He spoke about his experience, not with anger, but with a call for accountability and understanding. "We cannot allow fear or prejudice to guide our actions," he said, his voice steady. "We must hold each other to a higher standard, not just as individuals, but as a community. Change begins with us, with the choices we make every day." The room erupted in applause, and James felt a sense of purpose reignite within him. He realized that his journey was far from over. He had spent his life serving his country, and now, in his retirement, he had found a new mission: to inspire others to stand up for what was right. Liam Jones, the power of a witness. For Liam Jones, the young man who had recorded the incident, the experience was a lesson in the power of individual action. His video had sparked a wave of conversations, not just in the local community, but across the country. Strangers reached out to thank him for his courage, and activists used the footage to advocate for police reform. Liam was initially overwhelmed by the attention, but he quickly realized the importance of his role. He began attending community meetings, speaking about the responsibility of citizens to hold authority figures accountable. His message was simple but powerful. Change starts when we refuse to look the other way. The aftermath. As the investigation into Ryan Blake's conduct unfolded, the evidence against him mounted. His history of complaints and excessive force came to light, painting a damning picture of a man who had long used his badge as a shield for his ego. He was ultimately dismissed from the force, his career in ruins. Sean Miller, on the other hand, became a beacon of hope within the precinct. His willingness to speak out earned him respect from colleagues and community members alike. He worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, dedicating himself to mentorship programs and community outreach. And James Carter, he continued to live his quiet life on the outskirts of town, tending to his garden and cherishing time with Emily. But his voice echoed far beyond his small cabin, inspiring others to challenge injustice wherever they found it. The highway where it all began remained unchanged, a stretch of asphalt cutting through the countryside. But for the people who had crossed paths there, it became a symbol, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, dignity and courage could ignite ripples of change. The rising movement. In the weeks that followed the incident on the lonely stretch of highway, the story of James Carter and his encounter with Officer Ryan Blake evolved into a rallying cry for justice, dignity, and systemic reform. What had started as a singular moment of defiance against abuse of power now grew into a grassroots movement with far-reaching consequences. James Carter, a reluctant leader. James Carter sat on the porch of his modest cabin, gazing out at the neatly tended garden that brought him so much peace. The world beyond his quiet life had exploded with activity, with people eager to hear from the retired admiral who had faced injustice with unwavering grace. Calls and messages flooded his flip phone, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at events, piling up like the leaves that now fell gently from the trees around his home. Emily, ever his spirited advocate, sat beside him, scrolling through her phone. "Grandpa, you've been trending for days. People are calling you the face of accountability. They're even organizing rallies in your name." James sighed deeply, his hands resting on his knees. "I'm no activist, Em. I'm just an old man trying to live a simple life." Emily's face softened. "I know, Grandpa. But you've always taught me that when the world needs someone to step up, we should answer the call." Her words struck a chord. James thought back to his days in the Navy, commanding ships and making decisions that often meant the difference between life and death. He had never sought power or recognition, only the opportunity to serve. Now, it seemed, life was calling him to serve again, but in a way he had never anticipated. He nodded slowly. "All right, Em. Let's see where this leads." The town hall meeting. A call to action. A week later, James found himself standing in the largest auditorium in the county, a microphone in hand and a sea of faces before him. The room was packed to capacity, with people spilling into the hallways and an overflow crowd gathered outside, listening through speakers. News crews had set up cameras in the back, their lenses trained on the unassuming man at the podium. James cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Good evening, everyone. I'm honored that so many of you chose to be here tonight." He paused, looking out at the crowd. His eyes fell on Emily in the front row, her expression filled with pride and encouragement. Beside her sat Sean Miller, who had come in plain clothes, his presence a quiet act of solidarity. "My name is James Carter," he continued. "I served my country for over 30 years in the United States Navy. I faced challenges on the high seas and made decisions that weighed heavily on my conscience. But nothing prepared me for what happened a few weeks ago on that highway." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "What I experienced was not unique," James said. "It happens every day to people who are judged by the color of their skin, the way they dress, or the car they drive. But I was fortunate. I had witnesses. I had a platform. And now, I have a voice." He paused again, letting his words sink in. "But this movement isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about building a society where dignity, respect, and fairness aren't privileges, they're rights." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the walls. James waited patiently for the noise to subside before continuing. "Change begins with small actions," he said. "It begins with holding ourselves accountable, speaking out against injustice, and standing together. So tonight, I ask you, What will you do to make a difference?" When he finished, the room rose to its feet in a standing ovation. James stepped back, humbled by the response, but also filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Liam Jones, a catalyst for accountability. Liam Jones, the young man whose video had gone viral, became an unexpected hero in the growing movement. His decision to record the incident had sparked a national conversation, and he was determined to use his newfound platform responsibly. Liam began attending rallies and panel discussions, sharing his story and emphasizing the importance of citizen accountability. At one such event, he stood before a crowd of students at a local university. "I'm not a lawyer, a cop, or an activist," Liam said, his voice earnest. "I'm just a guy who saw something wrong and decided to act. We all have that power. It doesn't take a badge or a title to stand up for what's right. It just takes courage." His words resonated deeply, especially with young people. Social media lit up with posts quoting Liam, and the hashtag #StandWithJames began trending globally. Sean Miller, redemption through action. For Sean Miller, the aftermath of the incident was both a reckoning and an opportunity. He had made mistakes, staying silent when he should have spoken up, but he was determined to make amends. Miller approached Captain Hayes with an idea. "We need to rebuild trust," he said, "and it has to start with us." Hayes listened as Miller outlined a plan for a community engagement program. The initiative would involve officers volunteering at local schools, hosting open forums with residents, and participating in workshops on racial bias and de-escalation techniques. "I want to help lead it," Miller said, his voice firm. "I need to." Hayes agreed, and the program quickly gained traction. Miller threw himself into the work, connecting with people on a personal level and demonstrating that he was committed to being part of the solution. The broader impact. The movement sparked by James Carter's story didn't stop at the local level. Advocacy groups and civil rights organizations seized on the momentum, pushing for policy changes and accountability measures in police departments across the country. New legislation was introduced at the state and federal levels, aimed at increasing transparency and reducing incidents of misconduct. Body cameras became mandatory in many jurisdictions, and training programs were overhauled to emphasize community policing and cultural sensitivity. James, meanwhile, continued to speak at events, his quiet strength inspiring countless individuals to take action in their own lives. But he always returned to his cabin, seeking the solace of his garden and the steady rhythm of nature. Ryan Blake, a lesson in humility. For Ryan Blake, the consequences were severe. His dismissal from the police force was only the beginning. The viral video and subsequent investigation exposed a pattern of misconduct that tarnished his reputation and left him struggling to find employment. For months, Blake wrestled with bitterness and denial. But as the noise around the incident faded, he was forced to confront the choices that had led him to this point. Slowly, begrudgingly, he began to reflect on his actions and the damage they had caused, not just to James, but to the community he had sworn to serve. One day, he reached out to Sean Miller. "I want to make things right," he said simply. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. Whether Blake would fully redeem himself remained to be seen, but for the first time, he was willing to try. A legacy of hope. Years later, James Carter's name would still be spoken with reverence in the town where he lived. The highway where the confrontation had occurred became a symbolic landmark, a reminder of the power of courage and integrity. For James, the movement that had grown from his experience was not about him. It was about the countless lives that had been touched, the systems that had been challenged, and the hearts that had been changed. Sitting on his porch one evening, watching the sun set over the horizon, James felt a sense of peace. Life had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but he had risen to meet those challenges with the same quiet strength that had guided him through decades of service. And he knew that the ripples of his actions, and those of the people who had stood with him, would continue to spread long after he was gone. A new horizon. Years after the events that had thrust James Carter and a quiet stretch of highway into the national spotlight, the impact of that moment continued to resonate, not just in James's life, but in the lives of those who had been forever changed by it. The ripples of that encounter reached far and wide, creating new opportunities, altering perspectives, and shaping a future defined by hope and justice. The Carter Initiative. James Carter never intended to become a national figure, but fate had a way of setting its own course. What began as a local movement to address police misconduct and community relations grew into a nonprofit organization named the Carter Initiative, dedicated to fostering dialogue, accountability, and equality in law enforcement. The initiative's programs were as diverse as its supporters. Workshops brought together officers and community members to share their experiences and rebuild trust. Scholarships were offered to young people pursuing careers in criminal justice, with an emphasis on ethics and reform. James himself became a mentor to many, offering wisdom drawn from his years of leadership and service. At the initiative's first national conference, held in Washington, D.C., James addressed an audience of thousands. His voice, still steady and commanding despite his age, carried through the grand hall. "When I stood on that highway, I didn't know that moment would lead to this," he began. "But I did know one thing. We cannot let fear, prejudice, or silence define us. Change begins with one person speaking up, one act of courage, and one commitment to justice." The applause was thunderous, but James remained humble, reminding everyone that the movement was bigger than any individual. It was about building a future where such incidents would no longer be possible. Sean Miller, the officer who chose change. Sean Miller stood in the back of the conference hall, watching his former adversary turned mentor address the crowd. In the years since the incident, Miller had transformed into a true champion of justice. The community engagement program he had spearheaded at the precinct had become a model for departments across the country. Miller's work didn't stop there. He collaborated with the Carter Initiative to develop a national curriculum for police training, emphasizing de-escalation techniques, cultural awareness, and the importance of community policing. The program, aptly named Bridging the Gap, became a cornerstone of modern law enforcement education. That evening, Miller found himself sitting across from James at a quiet dinner table. The two men shared a bond forged in the fires of conflict, now tempered by mutual respect. "I want you to know," Miller said, his voice thick with emotion, "that day on the highway, it changed everything for me. You showed me what it means to stand tall, even when the odds are against you." James nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "And you proved to me that it's never too late to do what's right." Ryan Blake. A Long Road to Redemption. Ryan Blake's fall from grace had been harsh and unrelenting. Public scrutiny, financial struggles, and the loss of his career had forced him into a period of painful introspection. At first, he clung to anger and resentment, blaming everyone but himself. But as the months turned into years, the isolation wore down his defenses, leaving him face to face with the man he had become. Blake's turning point came unexpectedly, during a chance meeting at a community outreach event hosted by the Carter Initiative. He had attended anonymously, drawn by curiosity and the faint hope of understanding his place in the world. There, he saw James Carter speaking to a group of young people, his words filled with compassion and wisdom. For the first time, Blake allowed himself to truly listen, not as a man clinging to his authority, but as someone seeking redemption. After the event, Blake approached James hesitantly. "Admiral Carter," he said, his voice unsteady, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to apologize for what I did." James studied him for a moment, then extended a hand. "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step toward making amends," he said. "What matters now is what you do next." That conversation marked the beginning of a slow but sincere transformation. Blake volunteered with the Carter Initiative, speaking about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of accountability. While some remained skeptical of his intentions, Blake was determined to rebuild his life with integrity. Emily. Carrying the torch. Emily, James's spirited granddaughter had always admired her grandfather's resilience and strength. Inspired by his journey, she pursued a degree in social work, determined to make her own mark on the world. She joined the Carter Initiative after graduation, taking on a leadership role in its youth outreach programs. Under Emily's guidance, the initiative launched a nationwide campaign called Stand Tall, aimed at empowering young people to become advocates for justice in their communities. The campaign included workshops, mentorship opportunities, and a vibrant social media presence that connected participants across the country. During one workshop, Emily addressed a group of teenagers who reminded her of herself. "My grandfather taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about standing up, even when you are. You all have that courage inside you. Use it to make a difference." A highway reimagined. The stretch of highway where it all began became a symbol of transformation. The community raised funds to install a small memorial along the roadside, featuring a plaque that read, "In honor of James Carter and all who stand for justice, let this place remind us that dignity, courage, and unity can change the world." The site became a destination for those seeking inspiration, a quiet reminder that even the most unassuming moments could spark a movement. James Carter, the legacy lives on. In his later years, James retreated to his cabin more often, finding solace in the rhythm of his garden and the company of Emily. But even as he aged, his influence remained undiminished. The Carter Initiative grew into a lasting legacy, a testament to his unwavering belief in the power of individual action. One crisp autumn evening, James sat on his porch, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. Emily joined him, a cup of tea in her hands. "Do you ever think about that day on the highway?" she asked softly. James nodded, a thoughtful smile playing on his lips. "I do. It reminds me that life has a way of testing us in unexpected ways. But it's not the test that defines us, it's how we respond." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson, James felt a profound sense of peace. His journey had been long and challenging, but it had also been filled with meaning. And though his chapter was nearing its end, he knew the story was far from over. The seeds he had planted would continue to grow, carried forward by those who had been inspired by his courage, his dignity, and his unwavering commitment to justice. This concludes Part 6 and the story of James Carter and the movement he helped ignite. Let me know if you'd like to expand further on any aspect of the narrative.